There was a man who was in his 60s, and when he was like 19 or so, he had an LSD experience that was terrifying. What he did do is he decided he would kill himself by running into another car. And at the very last minute, he veered off and ran into the mountain rather than this other person. The MDMA trip helped him to look more deeply even at the mistake that he had made, and was finally able to undo that and to live with himself and to move forward in a more healthy way. We help each individual patient develop their own therapeutic approach. We want them to be their own healers because we want people to be able to continue the healing process after the therapeutic interaction is over. It's how do we help them not give away their power, like I did this with the help of all these therapists, psychiatrists, and drugs. Matt contacted me recently and said that because of the fires in Maui, that there was a lot of people with PTSD, and he wondered, could we bring MDMA-assisted therapy to Hawaii to help those people that were traumatized by the fires? So the purpose of this trip is to try to plant the seeds for developing a study that would be done in Maui with people who were traumatized from the fire, the survivors. But also we would try to train local healers. What would I want my great-great-grandchild to really remember about me? That I just had this vision for how I could make a contribution to making a more loving, healthy world to deal with all the traumas, and that I ended up pursuing that idea for basically my entire rest of my life. So that they would then say, well, what do I want to do with my precious short life? I would like to do something that matters and that can matter to other people.
Greater Good Radio, connect, learn, heal, and grow, is brought to you by Brain Gain Hawaii, a boutique executive recruiting, career development, and coaching firm. Learn more at braingainhi.com. Welcome to Greater Good Radio. Today's guest is Rick Doblin, the president and founder of MAPS.
The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies.
That's a big word. How did you guys come up with that name?
Well, so this was again in 1986. And there was a period of time where, psychedelic research had been shut down for, at this point, almost 2 decades. And so I knew that I wanted a letter P in the name. I wanted the word psychedelic in the name of this nonprofit, because people have used these words in a negative way, and then you kind of reclaim them. And so psychedelics had this connotation with wild parties and hippies and reckless and stuff, and it was controversial. So I know I wanted psychedelic in the name in order to try to reclaim it in people's minds. So then Stan Groff, who was the leading LSD researcher and my mentor, and I met him in 1972 and 1982, and he'd written a book called Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research, and he talked about it as the cartography of the unconscious, sort of the maps to the unconscious. And then Ralph Metzner, who was with Ram Dass and Leary at Harvard, Ralph Metzner had wrote a book called Maps of Consciousness. So I said, okay, maps, cartography, we got maps, we got a P in there for psychedelic. Now I just have to figure out what the M, the A, and the S would stand for. And so the first thing was multidisciplinary. So I wanted this to be, we look at it from science, from religion, from creativity, from therapy, look at psychedelics from all these different ways, neuroscience. So MAPS, then this idea that it's an association, it's a group, it's an organization. We have several thousands of members, and so Multidisciplinary Association, and then it was psychedelic, and then the S was studies, to emphasize that we do research. Now, when I did this was early on in the 90s, and so I got maps.org, but if I would have been smart enough, I would have got maps.com, and I could have sold the maps.com website name for a lot of money for the nonprofit. And so it turned out to be, I think, a really good name. It's short. Also, there was this incredible kind of both sad story, is that I got contacted in the early 90s by someone who said that he'd had a son that died in a motorcycle crash as a teenager, and he and his wife had gotten a lot of benefit from MDMA to help them process the grief. And he wanted to pay back, and he said he wanted to offer us a website. And I said, what's a website? So we were like the number 600 website in the whole world.
Oh, wow. That person must have been pretty advanced.
Oh, yeah. He was deep into the technology world. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it became maps.org, and That's where the name came from. And I've been really glad because it's this idea that we are really helping understand what the terrain of the unconscious is, how to help people, navigate these inner spaces.
If somebody's never really been exposed to psychedelics and all they have heard is the propaganda campaign, the negativity and so on, how would you explain this to them?
Well, psychedelic is a word that was invented in the 1950s by Dr. Humphrey Osmond, and he was doing work with LSD. And he was in communication with Aldous Huxley, who wrote the book Island and Doors of Perception. And so the word was created to mean psychedelis, so it's mind manifesting. So in a broadest interpretation of the word, dreams are mind manifesting, meditation is mind manifesting, psychedelic drugs that bring things to the surface are mind manifesting, hyperventilation, breathing. There's a lot of different things. So I've tried to normalize psychedelics by making people understand that the states of consciousness come not just from the drugs, but from all different ways. So I'd say first off, it's about bringing things to the surface like your dreams. The difference is, of course, that you can't wake up. In a dream, if you have something scary, you can kind of wake up, but here you got to power your way through it and surrender to it. The other thing to help people understand is that when we think about Western culture, where did sort of Western culture begin was with the Greeks, thousands of years ago. And so the Greeks were the ones that started democracy. And they also had the longest running mystery ceremony in the world that we know of, from 1600 BC to almost 400 AD, and it was called the Eleusinian Mysteries. And it was involving a psychedelic potion that people would drink, and it would sort of teach them the death rebirth process. So psychedelics have been used for thousands of years by humanity. All different cultures have used different psychedelics, different mushrooms, different peyote from cactuses, ayahuasca, putting leaves and vines together, iboga, which is the root of a plant in Africa. So everywhere you go, different human cultures have had different ways to alter their consciousness. We know a lot about shamanic drumming is one way to do that too. So psychedelic is something that really is rooted in humanity and human evolution, and we have many other experiences other than just through substances. So I think to try to help people understand what psychedelics do, it's still really hard to describe in a way that when people, let's say they take their first psilocybin trip, the words didn't quite capture what it does. Mm-hmm. So I try to help people understand that there's classic psychedelics that are like the LSD or mushrooms or peyote, ayahuasca. And what they tend to do is weaken your sense of self. So we have this kind of ego orientation that we're there. It's about protecting our body, our human life, looking for threats, looking for opportunities, but it's about our individual self. And that's important. We need to have that part of our brain that looks out for us as individuals. But we're part of communities. We're part of something much bigger. Humans are very much social. And so this part of our identification as an individual gets weakened under the classic psychedelics. And so people lose their sort of orientation as an individual, and you can often merge into something larger and bigger. And that's something that people get a lot of strength from, a lot of courage, a lot of peace. People talk about it as this unitive mystical state. And then also psychedelics bring to the surface things that have been repressed. And that's where you have therapy to help people process the emotions. So I think when people think about psychedelics, maybe the closest, in addition to dreams, is hyperventilation. You just complete...
Like with the breath work or just breathing during psychedelic journey?
Both. Yeah. So the breath work was intentionally developed in some way. I mean, it's been used for thousands of years also, but the breath work was by Stan Grof. He calls it holotropic, meaning moving towards wholeness, but it's hyperventilation to bring out experiences that he developed that after LSD was criminalized. And he wanted a way that you could still catalyze those experiences that couldn't be made illegal. And he's like, nobody will ever be able to make breathing illegal. But as it turned out, the French did it. For a while, France has laws against cults, and they decided that the holotropic breathwork was a cult, and they blocked it in France for a while. So I think when I try to help people understand psychedelics, I'll also say that there's sort of non-classic psychedelics that are like MDMA. So MDMA operates in mind manifesting ways. Things come to the surface, but it's sort of the opposite of classic psychedelics in that it doesn't weaken your sense of self. In a way, it strengthens your sense of self. But you become less defensive, more self-acceptance. And so you settle in to who you are, but you can also have thoughts that would otherwise be too painful about how you've made.
Is it dissociative then? Like ketamine?
Well, it's not a dissociative. I would say it's the opposite. It grounds you into yourself. And I've talked about this with Dick Schwartz and Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book The Body Keeps the Score, that one of the main techniques, if people are traumatized, is to dissociate. You know, it's not happening to you. You're not there, particularly if it's very painful. You kind of dissociate. And so what MDMA does is it helps you to collect your parts. So it's, in a way, the opposite of dissociation. It's collecting you together. There's actually a researcher, Dr. Steve Martyr, that's starting a study for MDMA for schizophrenia. And in schizophrenia, we think about it as your parts are split apart and you're not in touch with all of your full self. So the MDMA lowers the fear. It reduces activity in the amygdala, or fear processing part of the brain, and it helps people to process difficult emotions. It makes people better listeners. It sort of quiets a lot of the parts of our mind that's thinking, what am I going to do next? What have I just done? And you become more into the moment. And it releases oxytocin, which is the hormone of love and nursing mothers and connection. So you feel really safe and grounded and connected, and you want to socialize and you want to see people as who they really are. So that acts as in a different way than the classic psychedelics. Ketamine is called a dissociative anesthetic, but in anesthesia, you go out to the point where you don't remember anything and your body can be operated on. But the psychedelic dose is roughly 1/10 the anesthetic dose. And so you have to kind of modulate the dose carefully so that you can remember what happened, and you have that. Then there's 5-MeO-DMT, otherwise known as the toad. It's the venom of a toad. It's more like the classic psychedelics, except it's just this instantaneous blast off to this unitive state, and it only lasts 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So there's different psychedelics that do different kind of things, and what we're trying to do is bring forward the entire field of psychedelic medicine. So even though MAPS as a nonprofit is focused on MDMA research and other companies are focused on psilocybin research, our goal is really twofold. One is to open the door for pathways through the FDA and through other regulatory agencies around the world to make psychedelics into medicines. Then the other is to do drug policy reform, to make them available for people who just want personal growth or just want a spiritual experience, or maybe want to do it for depression but want to do it with peer support. So I think that there should be free access for adults in what we call licensed legalization. So what that means is that if you're a drunk driver, for example, you can get arrested for drunk driving, you lose your driver's license, but you can walk into any bar or liquor store and still buy alcohol. But your problems were caused, your social problems to others were caused by alcohol. So what I think we should do is switch to a drug policy where you have a license to do different drugs. The same way that we have a license to drive a car. And if you screw up in the car, you lose your license. If you screw up under the influence of drugs and do something that hurts somebody else or potentially even hurt yourself is not really a wise thing, then you can lose your license to buy that drug for a period of time while you get some sort of an education class or something. So I think that we should have this license legalization, we have medicalization, and then psychedelic churches, which are growing in popularity and all over the country, actually, and there's very little enforcement on them. So one of my favorite examples is the Church of Ambrosia, which is in the Bay Area. It has 100,000 members, and they provide mushrooms to members of the church.
Is that like Oakland?
Yeah, yes. You guessed. I think all of these kind of ways to try to help people understand what we mean by psychedelics.
So if people are listening to that and they say, okay, I hear all about these different things, I still don't really understand it, why would somebody do this? What's the benefit? And then what's the benefit of letting somebody else do that?
Well, there's no requirement,
right?
That anybody do these things. So we're not saying people should do them, but
I think it's more like, why should it be legal?
Yeah.
Because we see all these things that are spooky about it.
Okay, so, I went to the Kennedy School of Government and have my master's and Ph.D. from there, and it's on the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics and marijuana, but I also studied drug policy. So, as to why it should be legal, the first answer is that the drug war and drug prohibition is fundamentally counterproductive. It is not about reducing drug abuse. It's not helpful. All these laws that we have against different drugs. And so, last couple of years in America, over 100,000 people died from overdoses from opiates and fentanyl. In America, when we went to Vietnam, there was something like 56,000 people died, soldiers in Vietnam. And just think how much of a national trauma that was to America. But we have almost twice as many people dying every year. This year it's going down finally, but twice as much practically for the last couple of years dying from overdoses than died in Vietnam. So the drug war doesn't work. The drug war fosters enormous corruption. It fuels underground violence. It provides all sorts of resources to criminal gangs, but it doesn't really fundamentally help the people that it's supposed to be helping. And psychedelics have a lot of benefits when used wisely. They can also be dangerous. So it's not in the thing. So the problem with the drug war is that it puts the properties onto the thing itself, like this is a good drug, this is a bad drug, but actually it's about the relationship that you have with it. So the best example of that, I'll say, is thalidomide. So we heard about thalidomide in the 60s, that women took it for morning sickness, for being pregnant, but it produced incredibly deformed babies. They would be born without limbs. They would...
Yeah, my mom took that. So I don't know. This is how I look. But yeah, my
really?
My mom, yeah.
Wow, how did you find that out?
She said, I took that medicine that made all the babies messed up, but I don't know.
Wow, so thalidomide was considered the quintessential bad drug, but now it's a medicine for cancer and leprosy. Certain kind of things constricts blood vessels to cancers, and so it's made into a medicine under very careful ways. There's a patient registry. They make sure that no pregnant woman ever gets it again. But it's something that is, depending on how it's used, it's either good or bad. The other thing about the drug war is that it's been used to persecute minorities. That's been one of the main ways. So that one of the first laws actually against drugs in America were against opium in the 1880s or so. And this was when the Chinese laborers were helping to build the railroads. And then they completed some of that work. And then they were competing for other jobs, and so we couldn't criminalize that, but their drug use, which was opium, was criminalized. Marijuana was criminalized because it was used by African Americans and Mexicans. After alcohol prohibition was instituted in America, it was a terrible thing, and then it was replaced. And then a lot of these police were looking for something to do, so that they criminalized cannabis. Psychedelics were criminalized because hippies and counterculture and protests. So the drug war right now, actually in America, I'm not sure how it is in Hawaii, maybe you would know, but in Florida, they have what they call felony disenfranchisement. That means that if you are arrested for a felony, you cannot vote anymore. So the drug war has been used to persecute minorities, arrest them in large numbers, there's mass incarceration, and take away people's rights to vote. So all of this gets back to, why should we legalize psychedelics? Because under certain conditions, they can be very beneficial, and people have the right to make mistakes, in the sense that we can't protect people against themselves, or we can try, but we need to educate people. But I think that we're at a critical time in humanity where one of the concerns is that we have now developed incredible technologies, incredible weapons, incredible ways in which we produce energy. We've changed the climate. Where extinction is massive in terms of all sorts of species. We're bleaching the corals. We're doing all sorts of different things. And psychedelics can help people kind of wake up to what's been suppressed, but also to feel your interconnection with nature and with people that are different than you. So I think the kind of consciousness shift that we need to do in the world, in humanity in general now, I would say is similar to what happened with Copernicus and Galileo when, hundreds of years ago, people thought the Earth was the center of the universe. And it turned out, no, that's not the case. But we also tend to think now that we are the center of the universe, individuals, and that this idea that we need to move beyond to realize that we're part of this bigger system and work to protect it. Stan Grof has said that psychedelics used wisely and with the proper cautions can be for medicine and psychology what the telescope is to astronomy and the microscope is to biology. It really could give us a view into our own psyche. Carl Jung has said, the Jungian psychologist had said something that we need to study psychology. We need to know more about our own psyches because we are the only real danger that exists, and that we need to understand ourselves. We don't really understand that well because we are the source of all coming evil. This was Carl Jung in 1959, a few years before he died. So I think what I take from that, we are the source of all coming evil, is this separation, that we separate ourselves from others. We can be prejudiced, we can be hurtful, we can demonize and always us and them, and that's really destructive. So psychedelics can move us beyond that to feel our interconnection. Psychedelics can also help cleanse the doors of perception or the windows of perception, meaning that we see the world through our filters of our traumas and our past experiences. So we don't really see the world as it is, we see it through these filters. And psychedelics can help you understand what your filters are. This is not the only example, but this is one time that I was doing LSD and I was going to a Grateful Dead concert and I was just getting the ticket. So when you get your ticket, there's usually a woman or man, but it could be, and this was a glass partition, and you put your money in, you get your ticket underneath this. And so I'm just sitting there tripping, and then I noticed that in this glass between us, which I was just looking through, was my reflection, was her reflection, that there was this whole screen between us that I had not seen. And now under the LSD, I was seeing that. And so this, just your projections, or people that have been traumatized are a good example. They see the world through a lens of fear and distrust. And so psychedelics used in therapy can help us work through that. I also think that there's this sort of human right to explore our own consciousness. We talk about the Bill of Rights, like the freedom of the press, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, and all of them are kind of based on the freedom of thought. And the freedom of thought is something that you can alter with psychedelics, so that all of those reasons, I think, why that they should be free. Now, it doesn't mean everybody should do them, but I think for people who are curious about how they're made up, are curious about these interconnections with all that is, with people that are different from them, psychedelics can really be profoundly life-enriching and life-changing. And we see that with studies of depression and PTSD, where, split off parts of themselves. People are just, particularly when you've been traumatized, it's very painful. So people can integrate those parts and move forward and not be triggered and not be sort of ruled by their suppressed material. Then you come to terms with it. So those are some of the reasons why I think that psychedelics should be legal and people should learn about them.
For MAPS and the clinical trials that you folks are doing, the results are kind of amazing. So, like in a nutshell, can you explain that to somebody who has no idea?
Well, let me say amazing. What amazing means is that we felt that we had to work with the hardest cases. So we've studied MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. And we work with people that have had PTSD for a long period of time. They have severe PTSD or moderate to severe PTSD, but almost everybody.
And then PTSD, like in just a small definition, is what?
Okay, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It means that after a trauma has happened, people don't really recover from it fully. And so they carry these fears, or, people will avoid going down certain streets that remind them of something. A lot of avoidance behavior, but also hypervigilant. People are constantly searching the environment for threats. They have nightmares all the time. They're not able to really calm their nervous systems. They feel under threat all the time. It has a lot of physical disabilities. PTSD can be linked to diabetes, to other stress-related illnesses. PTSD changes the way people see the world. And so we work with these really the hardest cases. And unlike many studies with PTSD, we've enrolled people that have previously attempted suicide as well.
Like over and over? Or
well,
once?
Yes. Yeah, sometimes people have tried more than once. We had one person who tried commit suicide about 5 times before he came to our study, and he's never tried it again since. So PTSD is very debilitating, and there's SSRIs that people get for PTSD. Often they control the symptoms, but only to some extent. But they don't really get to the root cause. So people are on PTSD.
So it's an antidepressant.
Medicines. Yeah, it's an antidepressant. People can be on it for years. It deadens your emotions, deadens your libido. There's a lot of side effects for it. And there's therapies, but the therapies that work for some people can also be re-traumatizing for others because you have to confront your trauma. So what we showed is that people that had PTSD an average of 14 years, severe PTSD, that 2/3 of them no longer had PTSD at the end of our treatment. And our treatment is 3.5 months long, and it's only 3 MDMA sessions, 1 month apart, and it's 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions. 3 before the first one for preparation to build the therapeutic alliance, and then 3 in these 90-minute integrative sessions after the first, second, and third MDMA experience. So not only did we show that 2/3 of the people no longer had PTSD, but another 21% had clinically significant reductions of PTSD symptoms, which meant that their symptoms were better to the point where their life was changed, even though they still had PTSD. But what we've showed is that people tend to get better over time. Once you've learned that these feelings that are overwhelming, that you can handle them, you can let out the feelings, you won't dissolve, you won't be stuck, you can let out these feelings, then you can do that on your own without the drug. So our goal in the therapy is to help people learn the techniques that they were able to practice during the drug experience and be able to do that on their own without the drug. So it's the opposite of the SSRIs, where pharma companies like this idea that you have to take this pill every day for years. If you stop taking it, your problems come back. And sometimes they're very difficult to withdraw from. People have a lot of troubles who've been on SSRIs for a long time. So what we've shown is that we can get extraordinary results, better than any other of the therapies for PTSD, with very low dropout rates. People stay in it, and the results tend to be durable, and in many cases people get better. Now, some people will relapse occasionally, people that are in high-stress environments that other traumas happen to them, but it was considered a breakthrough therapy drug by the FDA, and it's considered to be the most important new development in the treatment of PTSD in around 40 years.
How did you get involved initially, and why did you choose MDMA?
So I was born in 1953, and family is Jewish, and so I was raised on stories of the Holocaust, which had just happened. And it just terrified me to hear the inhumanity and the cruelty that people would do to other people because they would say they were different. So my family was well off. My dad was a doctor, and I had this sense that the education I got, in addition to the stories of the Holocaust, was about these thousands of years where Jews are scapegoats, one after another, in different cultures, kicked out of Spain in 1492 and exiled, and all this. And it just made me think that you could have all the resources that you need for food, for shelter, for good work. You could have all the resources you need, but you could still be killed by this kind of scapegoating process. So it kind of moved me more towards thinking about mental illnesses as a threat to my life, more so than not having enough food or shelter. Then, as a young boy, was the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it looked like now the whole world could blow up. And I was a very impressionable young kid. And, in school you're taught to duck and cover, that if you just duck under your desk, you might be able to survive a nuclear explosion. It was not very reassuring, but it also further helped me realize that life itself was in peril, that this is not something we can take for granted, that humans for thousands of years have been a very violent species, killing each other, and that this whole thing could go up. So first was the Nazis, then it was the Russians, and then...
So all kind of panic going on in your system.
Very much.
Yeah.
Very much. And then for me now, finally, was the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
So it was now my own country. I was in one of the last years of the lottery, and now my own country was asking me to go to war for things that I thought didn't make sense, and many people thought it didn't make sense, and I think Vietnam War is a massive blunder on the part of America. Started our sort of downhill slope. But it just made me think of this message I got from my family was that we were immigrants, that my grandfather came over from Poland in 1920, fleeing anti-Semitism. My great-grandparents on the other side came over in 1880 from Russia, also fleeing anti-Semitism. So the story I was told is, you're immigrants, and that we managed to get a foothold here in America where it was free. We just got over the Holocaust. And now I grew up with, in some ways, all of the privileges that you could imagine. So I grew up at a time of American exceptionalism shortly after we won World War II. So I believed somehow Americans ruled the world, and we were better than other people in different ways, exceptional. Then Judaism, I'm the chosen people. I think everybody's chosen now, but that was part of it. Then I'm white and male. Family was well off. So I had every kind of benefit to think I could have an influence to change the world. And my parents were like, you're just this lucky generation of this multi-generational odyssey, immigrants who made it to America, the American dream, and now you've got freedom, and what are you going to do with this freedom? And I thought, how can I contribute to survival of my family, my religion, but also, more importantly, humanity? And so that became my sort of mission. And I thought more and more, like, how do I survive in a crazy world that's just constantly killing each other in different ways? And that led me to really think about learning about the other. So when I was in high school, I studied Russian to learn about the Russians after this Cuban Missile Crisis. And so my parents sent me to Russia after my junior year of high school. So I spent the summer in Russia with a bunch of 60 U.S. high school students learning.
So all of these thoughts and aspirations are from pre-high school?
Well, it was when I was 18 that I decided to focus my life on psychedelics, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Was it one specific event or what?
Yeah, well, two things that happened. Well, three things, I'll say, that happened. Okay. The first one was that I grew up believing all the propaganda. I'm the oldest of four kids. My parents didn't do drugs. They didn't drink alcohol. They didn't smoke cigarettes. So I grew up in kind of a rational, my grandparents had a bookstore. My dad grew up in a bookstore. Just was not exposed to any kind of drug culture or anything like that. And so I just believed that if you did LSD 5 or 6 times, you were certifiably insane. Mm-hmm. To be committed, that LSD was so dangerous that it would just drive you crazy. I also believed that it hurt your chromosomes and you would have deformed babies. And I believed that there was no reason why anybody should take these, that it was just escapism. But I was still trying to figure out about the mind and how do we deal with the scapegoating process and all of that. So I didn't really experiment in high school. But in my senior year of high school, a friend of mine gave me a book to read, and I loved it. And I handed it back to him, and he said, do you realize the author wrote some of this under the influence of LSD? And I was like, impossible. Nothing good comes from LSD. It's just distorted. It's hallucinations. It's nothing. Well, it was true. It was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. So it was that book that was the first step to make me question everything I've heard about LSD. If this incredible piece of literature could be written in part influenced by LSD, then I had been told an incomplete and false story about what LSD was. So that was the first sort of crack in the wall. The second was my decision to try LSD in college. And so I had been very disappointed by my bar mitzvah when I was 13. I had thought that this rite of passage would turn me into a man. That's the story. You're going to have this spiritual experience. You're going to go through this rite of passage. You do it in temple, God's going to come somehow or other. And so my bar mitzvah, nothing happened. It was an outer ritual that didn't engage my inner psyche in ways that I felt that I was ready for when I was 13. So I read this book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I decide to try LSD. And when I'm under the influence of LSD, I was like, this is what my bar mitzvah should have been. Because it's like, who am I? Where do I fit in? What is this bigger world? So
how much did you take?
Well, at the time, the standard dose was 250 micrograms.
Oh.
Now the standard dose is more like 80 micrograms or something like that. So this is like...
So you're not messing around.
Well, we didn't know. I mean, that was the standard dose at the time. Yeah. So I wasn't messing around. Yeah. We used to say that if you don't reach a place for a couple hours where you can't talk, you've not done enough. Yeah. So that was my own LSD experience. But it was very difficult because I was emotionally immature. I was scared. I didn't have a strong sense of self. So it was very frightening to sort of letting go and opening up to emotions that I had barely experienced and all my fears and anxieties. But I felt it was really important to do. And so I kept trying LSD. And I would end up being scared sooner and sooner. I'd get sort of stuck in this LSD experience sooner. And then I just like white knuckled, wait for the drink to wear off. But it was like this.
So you're scared every time?
I was scared every time.
And you still did it?
I still did because I felt there was something important I needed to get to. I needed to get to this more mystical understanding that the world around me was crazy. This was a potential. And maybe other people have this too. But the misunderstanding was that the more drugs you take, the faster you evolve. And so I thought, okay, that makes sense. I'll just take a bunch of drugs. And so I did that, and I would get more and more confused. I wasn't getting more evolved. So I completely underestimated the importance of the integration process. I overvalued the drug experience and undervalued the integration process. So this is now the third step. So I'm confused. I'm frustrated with my LSD experience, but it seems really, really important. And so I ended up going to the guidance counselor at college. Now, I was a freshman in an experimental college in Sarasota, Florida, called New College. It had started in 1965 with the first group. It had no grades, written evaluations, independent study. Everybody had to do senior thesis. The campus police said their job was to protect you from the real police. They had a tradition of all-night dance parties with psychedelics. The swimming pool was a nudist colony. So in Florida, I was like a super shy guy, could barely talk to a girl, and I'm hanging out in this nudist colony in the pool. It just felt like this environment where sex and drugs, the things that had been suppressed, were brought to the surface to try to purify them and to work with them.
Was that 70s?
Yeah, this was 1971 is when I started. And it was just fantastic. But I went to the guidance counselor to say, I need help with my tripping. And, you do that today, you get kicked out of school, depending on where you go. But for me, it was more that he took me seriously. And he said, this is really important, what you're doing. I understand. What I felt was that I was overdeveloped in my mind and underdeveloped emotionally and spiritually. And that the world was also, humanity as a whole has brilliant technologies, but we're underdeveloped in emotions and spirituality and connection. E.O. Wilson, an entomologist, I think, studies ants at Harvard, a brilliant scientist, has said that the real problem with humanity is that we have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions with godlike technologies. And so I went to the guidance counselor and I said, these are my struggles, help me. And he said, okay, this is legitimate, this is good, I'll help you, and here's a book to read. So this was the final step. So I'm 18 years old now, and this book was called Realms of the Human Unconscious, Observations from LSD Research by Stan Grof. The amazing part was the book was published in 1975, but my guidance counselor had a manuscript copy in 1972 directly from Stan. And so I'm reading this book, and this is about the research that was done at Johns Hopkins that he had done before in the Czech Republic. So Stan was grew up under the Nazis, grew up under the communists, did LSD work in the 50s and 60s. The communist Russia comes in to crush the Czech Revolution in 68. He escapes to America. He becomes he's an MD, Ph.D., becomes the lead psychedelic researcher at Johns Hopkins. And then the research with LSD gets shut down at Johns Hopkins, as well as in the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. And so he's now writing his book as he's getting ready to leave Johns Hopkins, where he can't do the research anymore. And I read this book. And this was the revelation for me that determined the course of the rest of my life. Because, first off, a scientific overview of the different states of consciousness, and he divided them, Stan did, in sort of three main areas. The first one is he called Freudian. Not that all the Freud's theories were right, but just that this was about things that happened during your life, neuroses, problems, Then he talked that there was a student of Freud's called Otto Rank. And what Otto Rank was saying is, yes, Freud is looking at all the things that happen when you're young, but the actual process of birth imprints on people certain kind of emotional states. The process of birth is such where you can feel like you're dying at parts of it, you're being constricted, you don't know what's going on. So he divided the process of birth into this oceanic bliss when you're just unified with your mother. Then there's these kind of starting to be these changes to get you ready to be born. Just this environment of bliss is starting to change. And then there's this sort of the actual process of birth. And then there's this fourth stage where now you're independent and you've survived. But people have these imprints from this process of birth. And then he said the third phase was, he called it the Jungian phase, the transpersonal psychology, the confrontation with spirituality, with death, with birth, with the sort of themes that everybody has, that all humans have. And what made it so important for me was that it was science looking at these experiences of unitive consciousness that sort of validated this idea, this theory of change, that if we feel we're interconnected, that can have important political implications. And so he was validating that this sense of interconnection really exists. But then the other part that made it all something that I really could go for was that it was a reality check with all of these theories, and the reality check was therapy. Can you use these drugs? Can you use these medicines? Can you use these theories to help people who are depressed or addicted to alcohol or addicted to opiates? And so Stan was wrapping all of this into therapy, which is like a process to become more alive, become more yourself, to become more unified. And so when I realized that was what was going on, this is now 1972, it was after the backlash. And so I thought, I have this freedom to do whatever I want. So Nixon was calling Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in America. Mm-hmm. And I was like, what is Timothy Leary doing right? That he's got such fear in Nixon. Well, Timothy Leary was saying, think for yourself, question authority, feel these interconnections, turn on, tune in, drop out, which then I did. I dropped out of college for 10 years to work on my psychedelics. But I felt like these tools that would help humanity evolve, both in therapy and spirituality, were being suppressed, and that it was a crazy, crazy world, and I didn't know what other ways to contribute, but I thought I'll use the privilege that I have and focus it on bringing back psychedelics, doing my own psychedelic healing, and becoming a psychedelic therapy. So that was 52 years ago. Wow. And every once in a while, I just think, God, I'm so lucky that 18-year-old had such a good idea, and it's made sense to me this entire time.
Yeah, that's a long time to stay focused, man.
Yeah.
Through all of that kind of hardship.
Well, and there's just so much richness that comes from these psychedelic experiences. I mean, every day I hear stories from people whose lives were changed with psychedelics in one way or another.
If you could only take one of those stories, what would it be? And you're going to forget every other one, but this is the only one you can keep.
Okay. So this is a story that has to do both with LSD and with MDMA. So the story is, there was a man who was in his 60s, and I got to know him because we were studying with Stan Grof. This is about 25 years ago. And what had happened when he was a young man, when he was like 19 or so, he had an LSD experience that was terrifying, that went wrong. And what happened during this LSD experience is that he was trying to feel connected, but he felt that he was an imperfect human being. And he got things twisted up in his mind. And what he ended up thinking is that the only way that he could show that he fully honored spirit and what he thought of as God would be to commit suicide, because he was a flawed human being. And so it's this sort of real punitive place he got into. And he said he was driving his car on the edge of the cliff, and he was thinking he would just drive his car off the edge. And he ended up not doing that. He did crash the car, but he crashed it into the mountain. But from that, he could never really trust himself. There was this part of him that had sort of been so punitive that it wanted him to end his existence. And over time, he had tried to work with this, and he had become a therapist. And so we met, and what he said was that it still burdened him, that there was still this deep level of distrust of his own inner psyche. And so we decided to do MDMA. And what happened under the MDMA was that he ended up revisiting this trauma, that the MDMA, through the reduction of fear, it helped him to look at this trauma in a different way. It also helped him to tell me actually a fuller story, because what he had done was even worse than what he had told me. He had decided he was in a car, he had thinking maybe he would run off the edge of the cliff. He didn't do that. But then he said what he did do is he decided he would kill himself by running into another car and have a head-on collision, and he would die. But that's also endangering somebody else. And so at the very last minute, he was doing that. And at the very last minute, he veered off and ran into the mountain rather than this other person. But this idea that he was even driven to kill somebody else as a way to try to get himself, that helped him to, once he could acknowledge the full depth of the horror of what he had done, and to realize that he needed to accept himself, not as, he didn't have to be perfect. He could be a flawed person. This was not the standard that he was using to judge himself was way too hard. This was an LSD trip gone wrong in many ways. He didn't have support when he was doing it. And so this was 40 years after that LSD trip that the MDMA trip helped him to look more deeply even at the mistake that he had made and to accept that and to feel really solid now that he would not need to do anything like that. He had learned in a way by accepting that he could now trust himself. And so that was just one of the most remarkable healing stories I'd ever seen. But it's a good illustration because it is the healing potential of MDMA by somebody who carried this trauma for 40 years and was finally able to undo that and to live with himself and to move forward in a more healthy way.
And since then, do you know how this person has been?
Yeah, oh yeah, he'd become a therapist and he's doing really well.
What would be another story you could share that you haven't shared in public but you would like to?
Okay, so here's the one that comes to mind is that, I wanted to be a psychedelic therapist. I wanted to do my own psychedelic therapy. I wanted to help others. That was from 1972, was when I developed that when I was 18. And then I dropped out of college for 10 years. I eventually went back to school to study to become a psychedelic therapist. And in 87, I graduated and I tried to get a clinical psych Ph.D. and nobody would let me in because the psychedelics were criminalized. And so that's where I sort of veered away and I realized that the politics were blocking the science. So I needed to study the politics. And that's where I went to Harvard and the Kennedy School. And that's where I learned in a way to do psychotherapy for sick public policies, sort of psychotherapy on cultural mindsets than on individuals. So I gave up the work becoming a therapist. So that's by way of introduction to say that at Burning Man, sometimes I work with people to try to help them in different ways as kind of a psychedelic therapist at Burning Man. Mm-hmm. It's like a little bit of like a free zone and stuff. And it sort of is where I'd love to be after we do a lot of this work and make MDMA into a medicine and the psychedelics get mainstreamed and psychedelic clinics, then I'd like to be a psychedelic therapist. So there was somebody that had obsessive compulsive disorder and he had hair pulling. He would pull his hair, he'd pull his eyebrows, he would pull his hair.
It's like trichinosis.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
A friend of mine, mentioning that to me.
That they have it? Or
the child has it.
Oh, yeah. It's a way where you deal with anxiety that way. Mm-hmm. So you get these anxieties that you feel like somehow or other are overwhelming, and the way to do it is to pull your hair. Mm-hmm. People have all different kind of obsessive compulsive.
Self-soothing of some sort.
Yeah,
right?
Even sometimes to the extreme where people do the cutting themselves.
Yeah.
But this person had a pretty problem about hair pulling. And so we did early work with MDMA, and we would only see each other like once a year at Burning Man. We lived in different places. And so we would do a series of sessions from year to year, some with LSD, some with MDMA, some with LSD-MDMA combinations. And what happened is over time, he was able to get over the obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, if we had seen each other more, we probably would have done sessions once a month or something like that. But it was just this case of this compulsion to deal with this anxiety that was overwhelming, that I could see both the depth of the inner work and then how that would manifest for him throughout the year, what he would learn from that, and then where we would start up again the next year with the next. So he didn't have people that he was doing psychedelic therapy with at home. And over a couple of years, it sort of culminated in one experience that was, for me, like showing the future. We had this special space that we would do psychedelic therapy in. It was a big teepee. And it was large enough that this woman wanted to know if she could set up her massage table there. And I said, sure, you can set up your massage table in there. We'll be sitting with people with psychedelics over here, but you can do that. So this was a person then, we were trying to work on this hair pulling, and we did a big LSD trip. And I had MDMA that was going to be maybe 3-4 hours after the LSD, would give him MDMA to smooth things out. But what happened is he was so open. It was just like this classic shamanistic death rebirth. He sort of turned into a skeleton. Everything was dismembered all about him. It was like he completely took himself apart. And then he
looks like ayahuasca kind of.
Very much. Yeah, very similar. Ayahuasca. Mm-hmm. And ayahuasca is a little bit more embodied and you're nauseous and you can throw up. LSD a little bit more heady. But it was this classic shamanistic kind of dismemberment and recapitulation. And it was just beautiful. And he was dealing a lot with loneliness and being alone and isolated. And he was so open to it that we decided we didn't really need to do the MDMA at all. Now, 8 hours goes along, and he's now coming down, but it was this aching loneliness that he had learned to not run away from, but to accept. And so once you can accept these anxieties or these fears, then you don't need to self-soothe in other ways. And I noticed, though, that this woman who had the massage table had just finished working with someone. And so I went up to her and I said, would you mind doing some body work with this fellow that's just coming down off of this LSD trip? And she said, yeah, she'd be glad to. And so we just picked him up from the mattress on the floor that we'd spent the whole day and just moved him onto the massage table. And then he got this massage that was just making him cry. It was like connection with another human after struggling for so long with accepting loneliness and isolation. And that's where I say it felt like the future of psychedelic clinics, where you would have psychedelics, you would have massage, you could have other techniques. And it was just this beautiful process. And so I just was with him this most recent Burning Man, and he's really doing well. These have sustained. He's doing great, and now he's learned to become a sitter to help other people with psychedelics even. So this idea, there's this Jungian archetype called the wounded healer. If you learn how to deal with your own wounds, you then become better able to help others.
That's all healers. Yeah, I think. I mean, nobody that I know of ever goes into the healing arts that doesn't have wounds that they're trying to research and figure out.
Yeah.
You know, that's interesting what you said on the latter part with the body work, because I know I had an experience in an ayahuasca ceremony where like there was some processing of just tremendous feelings of not being loved. And it was like really young. And then it was kind of at the tail end of the ceremony. But a friend of mine was with me. And then at the end, we didn't talk about it, but it was like being able to hug them or them hug me. And then it's almost like a reprogramming of the first or early kind of memory of you're loved, you're wanted, and so on. Kind of both. It was a huge experience because it's almost like just completely changing the narrative internally, but it was like a unconscious narrative. Does that make sense? Is that kind of similar to that? Or what?
So this idea of psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting, yes, you had this unconscious narrative that influenced a lot of your feelings and your behaviors.
Yeah.
But you weren't aware of it.
Yeah, it's unconscious.
And with psychedelics, it becomes to the surface. And then you can see it. And then if you can accept it and work with it, then you can change it.
Yeah.
And we're not aware of these things that have a lot of influence on our behavior. And that's why we need to do this kind of dredging and resurfacing and understanding. You know, there just was this incredible story recently that I heard about someone who was in a relationship, and it was, you know, really difficult. And the person was constantly angry and was asking questions of their partner, like, are you angry at me? Are you angry at me? And it was like getting to be this problem because this person didn't necessarily feel that anger, but it was getting like annoying, like so many times asking, are you angry at me?
You're just projecting on the partner.
Yeah. But then under a psychedelic experience, they were like, oh, you know, I could never rely on my mother. She would always like blow up at different times. And I was always having to check, is she angry at me? Is she not? So it was like that unconscious programming from the stress with the mother was projecting onto this new partner. And once they could sort of link it back to where, oh, it's not about this person, it's about my mother, then they could work through that, and then they could have this better relationship with their partner.
Right. That reminds me of the Carl Jung quote, which is, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will lead your life and you'll call it fate.
Yes.
Right? I'm very conscious on that one.
Yeah, that's a great quote.
You said your favorite Carl Jung one, what was it yesterday?
Yes, the most important social, political, and therapeutic thing we can do is to withdraw the projection of our shadow onto others.
And what does that mean to you?
Well, because I was so educated about the Holocaust, you know, so that the parts of ourselves that we don't accept, we project onto others. So this idea of the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we don't own, we turn into other people become the repositories of that, and they become our scapegoats, and so then we become prejudiced, and we need to do all sorts of things to them or just punish them. So I think this idea of how we see the world through a filter, we don't actually see what there, it's this shadow is being projected, because we can't accept this complex truth about ourselves because we're so brittle oftentimes. So withdrawing the protection of shadow means owning your own emotions, bringing things up from the unconscious and becoming healthier and seeing the world in a clearer way and not demonizing others.
I don't know if it was Chris Burris or it was some training I was in, and somebody had said something along the lines of, it's like the film of the past runs through like the projector of the present to the screen of the future.
Oh, I like that.
You know? So, and I thought, I was like, wow, that's an easy one to kind of picture, right? It's like all the film from the past. So if you change the past, which you can change, right? Because it's emotional memory is not always the same as actual events or memory. Then what runs through the projector and is projected onto the future screen is different.
Yes. People can make fundamental changes in how they relate if they can accept their shadow, if they can look at what happened in the past and see it in a more clear way and accept the emotions expressed. Stan also has this beautiful expression about the full experience of an emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion. And so that means that the way out is through, that if you're feeling depressed, to struggle against it is difficult. If you accept the depression, if you accept whatever it is you're grieving or whatever you're sad about, if you fully accept it, then it will change. And it's the resistance from accepting it that keeps it there. And that's where, again, the psychedelics come in, because they can take from what you've been resisting to helping you to experience it.
In one of the ayahuasca ceremonies, the big lesson for me down was like to tune in and turn toward. Because when something becomes difficult or challenging or scary or whatever, the tendency is to tune out and turn away.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
So I tell this story a lot because you're sitting in the actual room right now. Over there during COVID, my 5-year-old was on remote online school. That's online kindergarten. So can you imagine? And I'm
horrible.
over here doing my work, right?
Yeah.
So in literally 2 minutes, she's bouncing around over here. Hey, Dad, what's up? Trying to get my attention. And I'm on Zoom calls and I'm like, put it on mute and try to cover my mouth and be like, beat it. Go try to be off the screen, like go away. And more I do that, guess what happens to her, right? She wants to jump in more and gets more attention to the point where it's like, okay, I asked the person, I say, you know what? I got to hold on real quick. And then I can turn to her, give her all my attention. And it's like, what do you need? And she'll tell me okay, that's important. Yes. How are you? And once she really feels like seen and heard, then she's gone. I can't even give me a hug. Oh, where are you going? She's gone, right? And that's exactly kind of how I think about that internal, especially when you talk about parts and so on, right? So
that's a great example.
So maybe that leads us into IFS, right? So in IFS circles, we typically hear that, I guess in the MAPS, or at least in the beginning of MAPS, IFS is the therapy model or so on. What's the connection?
So MAPS I started in 86. It took us 5 different protocols submitted to the FDA, all rejected by the FDA. 1992, finally we can do the very first study with MDMA. The FDA changed, and that's really what's led to the psychedelic renaissance that we're in now. And then starting in 1999 and 2000, I started working with Dr. Michael Mithofer and working with PTSD. He had studied with Stan Groff in the holotropic breath work. He'd approached me at the world's first ayahuasca conference that Ralph Metzner had organized in 2000, and we met, and he said, I'm a member of MAPS. We had a couple hundred members only, but I didn't know who he was at that time. And within a few minutes, what he said was that he wanted to talk to me about setting up an offshore clinic. He had worked in St. Kitts with Dr. Deborah Mash, who had an Ibogaine clinic. And he said, let's set up a psychedelic clinic somewhere where we could give people MDMA or LSD or something like that. And within minutes, I said, look, I'm not interested in that at all. We have to go to the heart of the system and change from the inside out. I said, let's go to the FDA. I think we can now get permission to do stuff with the FDA. He was an expert in PTSD. He had been an emergency room doctor, but he had seen some of the people come back multiple times, and he realized that he wanted to get upstream in a way to work on the mental health. So he became a psychiatrist from being an ER doctor, and he was an expert in PTSD.
This is a very accomplished person.
Extremely accomplished. Yeah. And so then we started developing a protocol, trying to get permission from the FDA. which we eventually got. And so we then needed to create what's called a treatment manual that describes what is the therapy that we use with the MDMA. It's not just the MDMA. You take MDMA in an unsafe setting, or you can end up worse off. So we had to develop this treatment manual, and he had both studied holotropic breath work with Stan, but he'd also studied IFS with Dick Schwartz. And so what he suggested is, look, I see that with MDMA, people often spontaneously talk about their parts. He said, let's just take the IFS manual, and that'll become our treatment manual. And we thought about it for a bit, but I realized that we had to customize the treatment manual for MDMA, that IFS was not explicitly giving advice to therapists on how to work with MDMA. So we needed to be very conscious about it, MDMA. And also, IFS has its own vocabulary of exiles and protectors and a whole range of different kind of concepts. And so we realized that we needed to actually create our own new treatment manual that was in part based on the work that Stan Groff had done with LSD patients in the 60s and that had worked in the underground work with MDMA. Others had done that. So we created our own treatment manual, but it's very much the case that spontaneously under MDMA, people talk about their parts. Mm-hmm. And they do that a lot. And so Michael has actually made training videos of people spontaneously talking about their parts under the influence of MDMA, and has showed them at IFS conferences with Dick to show that just the core concepts that you've got, even if it's not the exact language he uses, but the core concepts are accurate, and they spontaneously manifest in people under the influence of psychedelics, not just MDMA. So I think it was a wise decision that we needed to create our own treatment manual to describe what we're doing, and you can use aspects of IFS during the therapy to talk to people about their parts, but it's always in response to what people come up. So we're trying to help people learn to heal themselves, to develop the skills to be their own self-soothing healer. And so we support what's emerging, this concept that there's this logic that we're not consciously aware of. So like when you had this realization of what it's like not to be loved, you can't always predict these things ahead of time, what's going to come up.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, and so what we tell people is, let's make a list of all the things that you want to deal with in your psychedelic session, and we'll talk about it in the preparation. Here's your issues. And then right before you get to take the drug, you just rip that list up and throw it away. And then whatever happens, we're going to support whatever happens. And your conscious mind may think one thing, but something else. So I think this sort of sense of this inner wisdom, so that when people start grappling with the complexities, then they are able to better identify sort of contradictory urges, and that becomes like your parts. Like this part is this part is that, or this idea of the protectors, that you're going too fast into something. So a lot of these psychological defense mechanisms have a good element in them. They are designed to protect you, but then they get overused, overstrong, and then they become harmful. But to try to find the good in them as well. So I think with IFS, it's really a very brilliant kind of understanding of what's called multiplicity, that we're not this single unified self, that there's different parts of ourselves. They bump up against each other. Some are contradictory. And you need to kind of surface all of them. So you asked earlier about, is MDMA a dissociative? So MDMA in particular will help you unify all these parts. So it's the opposite of dissociation. And through the classic psychedelics or ayahuasca, that when you work on these unconscious things and bring them to the surface, then they become part of your above ground self, which becomes more unified. And so over time, we hope to have access to all these different aspects or parts of ourselves to make kind of a unified decision about what we want to do. So IFS was very deep into Michael's early training, and we've seen it confirmed over and over again in the MDMA therapy sessions.
So in the current MAPS training, is IFS still used?
We don't use the terms, as I said.
Right.
But we do say that people will talk a lot of times spontaneously about their parts. So we talk about parts work. Mm-hmm. So, and that's, I think, the essence of IFS. We'll talk about parts work. And yeah, so that whenever people are starting to ask about that or report that, a part of me is this, you really encourage that. And then they explore it. And then you try to say, well, what are your other parts? And is there some way to take knowledge from this part, from that part, and come up with kind of a unified decision that you're wholeheartedly involved in? So I think the parts work is to try to bring all of those perspectives into one kind of unified decision-making process.
You ever met David Grand from Brain Spotting?
No, I've not.
Yeah. So Brain Spotting, they have a few principles, and one's like the uncertainty principle, which is, I may know like that it is, but I don't know what it is. Like something's going on, but I'm not going to be the expert because you're kind of the expert in your own system.
Exactly.
I may be the expert in this model. And then he said, we are the tail of the comet and the client is the head. So you follow them to an extent, and you're just helping to kind of guide and hold the space so that they can properly kind of process through what they need to process.
I like that a lot. Yeah. Carl Rogers talked about how one of his famous quotes is that actually psychotherapy is you recreate it for each individual patient, that you sort of customize this psychotherapeutic process for each individual patient. And so then what Michael's modification of that is that we help each individual patient develop their own therapeutic approach, in the sense supporting what's emerging, as opposed to imposing, figuring out what we're going to do to customize for them. We want them to be their own healers, because we want people to be able to continue the healing process after the therapeutic interaction is over. So it's how do we help them not give away their power? Oh, the therapist did this, or the psychiatrist did this, or the drugs did this, but more like I did this with the help of all these therapists, psychiatrists, and drugs, or whatever.
So that would be considered an integration process, right?
Yeah.
So what is your integration process?
A lot of it is this, still within this concept of, helping people address what's emerging. So the way that we structure the MDMA experience is to think about it as 2 days, not just a day experience. So the first day, we start usually at 10 in the morning or so. People can come to the hospital or wherever the treatment room is earlier. They do a little check-in, but then usually the session starts at 10 in the morning. It goes 8 hours. We do a supplemental dose after a couple hours of half the initial dose to make it go longer.
It goes longer, but not more intense is kind of the idea?
It kind of hits a plateau.
Yeah.
You can adjust the intensity a little bit. So we say that you can administer this second dose, half the initial dose, between 1.5 and 2.5 hours. So in protocols, you can have windows, like where you don't have to do it all at the exact same time. Well, for example, if you were to give 1.5 time at the very beginning, it would be stronger than just one.
Yeah.
And so the longer you wait...
But it would be a higher peak.
It would be a higher peak.
And it's still the same duration, whereas this one is more flat.
Yes.
Because otherwise they're peaking and you're like, I can't really do anything right here.
Well, you can a lot at the peaking. I mean, it's more difficult with the peaks of LSD or things like that. But even the peaking of MDMA, people are able to process.
Well, they'd be there by yourself without the therapist, or the sitter would be kind of just holding the space and checking out during that, or no? Not
well, it differs. Like there's moments where people don't talk to the therapist for an hour. So if you haven't heard from the patient in an hour, that's the idea, is you just check in. How are you doing? But people have these incredible dynamic, metaphorical, poetic, visual experiences that symbolize their life story, and they're retelling the story. I mean, I'm just reminded of one person who was a veteran and had rage. And he came home from the war, from Iraq, and he would throw things at his wife. He never hit her, but he just was like a bundle of rage. And under the MDMA, he had this feeling that his warrior self was like this gorilla that he had locked in a cage inside his chest. And that this gorilla had reached out of the cage with a knife and was stabbing him in the side. And then under MDMA, he's realizing this is a part of himself. It's a part that he doesn't fully trust because he saw what it did in Iraq, and he did horrible things in Iraq in some ways. But that he realized that he was making it worse for this part of himself to keep it all locked up. So he decided he would let it out. So he reached down and he pulled out the knife from his side, and then he unlocked the cage, and then the demeanor of this gorilla changed, and they hugged each other from these evil red eyes, and then they became friends, and then they were like catching up like old friends. So people will have this kind of inner process, and they're rewiring their brain in that process. They're bringing things up from the surface. They're dealing with the different emotions, and they can also be quiet for a very long time. So other times there can be at the peak, you can be wanting to share and wanting to talk. So it's different from different patients. But the idea, again, is that we give half the initial amount to make it longer. And that's what is this, what's called the optimal zone of arousal. So when you are traumatized and you're often like hyper vigilant, you're super aroused, everything is frightening, you hear a little noise and you jump and you think it's back in the war or whatever, but you can't make much progress when you're hyper vigilant. The opposite is that you are so emotionally numb as another defensive strategy that you don't feel anything.
It's like a alexithymia kind of?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, that you can't really feel your emotions. But then the MDMA brings you into this optimal zone where you're emotionally open, but you're calmer, your fear is reduced, and so you're not this hypervigilant, and so then you can process these emotions.
Is that different than window of tolerance?
No, it's the same thing.
Okay.
The exact same idea.
Mm-hmm. So someone has told me that for MDMA, it's more heart opening versus like psilocybin is more, I'm a part of this tree is a part of me, or so on.
But where we're going with this is this idea that we have this very long experience till around 6 p.m, and then often we have people spend the night at the treatment center.
Okay.
But then the integration process starts the very next day. So people rest, spend the night there, and then the therapists come back, and the integration process to begin with is going over what happened and what do they think about it and what are their emotions about it. And oftentimes people will be very emotional, releasing, crying, talking about what happened. And we can meet them for 90 minutes or sometimes longer. And then once a week for a couple of weeks, there's more meetings to do this integration process, to really understand not only what happened, but what lessons are there? How do you change your daily life? Are there people you don't want to be with, or people you do want to be with, or patterns you don't like? So the integration process is really trying to take some of the experiences and insights that happened during the MDMA experience, or this would be true for ayahuasca or LSD, whatever, and then trying to ground them in your daily life. So in psychedelic therapy, the difference I would say between psychedelic therapy and recreational use is that recreational use, you're going for the moment. You want to have fun. You want to have an experience. With therapy, you want to bring back from the experience through the integration process to change your baseline. Recreational, you just want to have fun, and you're not really trying to address anything or change anything, but the integration process is key. So there's all different kinds of integration processes. There's a process in prolonged exposure, which is one of the therapies for PTSD. And they're doing some research now where people will get an MDMA experience, and then they do this prolonged exposure for 90 minutes. Then they do inner-directed therapy, our approach, and then they go back to...
That's your name for it, is that what it is?
Inner-directed therapy, yeah. And then they'll do the prolonged exposure for 90 minutes, then they'll do inner-directed therapy again. But then the way they do it, it's a one-session model with MDMA, but then every day for weeks they write down their most intense trauma. And that's that integration process. So there's different ways to do the integration, but the main thing is really just to try to put into practice what you learn. So for example, what I find is that with the day after I do MDMA, I feel like there's like a fraction of a second lag between what somebody says and my normal patterns shifting in, that I have a little bit more time, fraction of a second, to think deeper, to sink deeper. And so we talk about what happens to you is what happens, but it's your reaction to that you have more control over. So with a little bit of a time lag in the day after MDMA, you have time, a tiny bit, to see, okay, that's what happened, but how do I react to it? Do I want to accept it? So I think that's a big part of this integration process, is helping people realize that they're not just whipped around by things that happen, that there's this choice that they make of how to respond to it, and you want to build up that strength so they can have more capacity to choose how they want to respond. By doing the MDMA during the day, then people often can get a night's sleep, and then the next day they're often very tired. And so we tell people, don't schedule anything. You can't even drive yourself home. Somebody has to come and get you. And that's the day for reflection and integration. And so I think the kind of exhaustion often, or the low mood that people talk about with MDMA, often it's because they go to work or they do things after this experience when their energy is more inner and reflective and regenerative and time for really thinking and reflecting, but then they're out in the world. So in our studies, we've shown that there's no more low mood in the people that have therapy with no MDMA than the people that have therapy with MDMA.
Oh, so you don't see a hard come down?
We don't see it in that way because we emphasize that this is for you to rest. This is for you. So people do have that energy depletion. And also, it's just magnificent the way in which under MDMA, it feels like you're your best self. You're somehow or other less defensive, more open, more focused, more present, able to deal with different emotions, better listener. You really want to know what people want to say. I felt that the first time I took MDMA, that I was just a better version of myself. So then when it wears off, a lot of people will feel like, that's really sad. Now I'm back to where I was before.
Get judgmental again. That's how I know something's wearing off. It's like, I just judged that person or something, or made a judgment. Like, oh, we're coming back.
Yeah, that's exactly. Yeah. So that can be sad. You've had something precious and beautiful, and then you lose it. Mm-hmm. And there is a sadness to that. But I think that's part of this integration process. And then you realize that, okay, that was precious. I know what that's like. Now maybe over this next couple of weeks, I can try to do that on my own. Or what we tell people is that one of the ways to think about what is an MDMA experience is to just take a deep breath. It's like you're settling into yourself. That's kind of what MDMA is. Self-acceptance, a certain warmth, you're present. So it's a small window into MDMA, is just to be there. But there's the emotional aspects of it, the self-love, the kind of relax in your mind of these fears. So I think that there's just a very important emphasis has to be on the integration process, because the goal, again, is for us to do several interventions, so 3 MDMA experiences with the non-drug psychotherapy, with the goal of trying to get people to the place where now they can handle new traumas themselves on their own without the drug. So the idea is that they're their own healers, and you really want to build their capacity to do that, because life will continue to present challenges.
You know how I think about it is that, like with a physical wound, I don't actually heal that physical wound. Like, I'm not here like, if I got a cut on my arm, it's not like heal, and I'm thinking heal. Yeah. It's creating an environment that's conducive for my body to heal itself, right?
Yes.
I feel like it's the same thing internally, which is there has to be an environment conducive to healing itself, which means a safe environment, psychologically, emotionally safe, no judgment in that container, the ability to express authentically in however that needs to be, whether that's physical, mental, whatever it is, right? And then allow that kind of process to kind of run. So I feel like with the psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, or even the ceremonies or so on, it's very different than just a fun time or something, because a fun time would be like having a hip problem, getting anesthesia, no one did any surgery, and then you come back out. You still have a hip problem, right? Yeah. Like this, the psychedelics in my mind, it kind of helps lower the pain so the hip surgery can be done, and then you come back out and you still have to, PT it and so on. Yes. That's kind of how I think about it. Is that what you see too?
Yes, I think that's a really great way to see that. Yeah. So actually, Michael Medover, who I mentioned, helped develop the treatment manual. It was an emergency room doctor before a psychiatrist. Mm-hmm. He used almost the same language that you just used. Oh. He would say that, let's say you get somebody that had a motorcycle accident, and they scraped the pavement, and they got all this embedded pavement in their wound. So his job is to take the impediments to healing out and create the context for the body to heal itself.
Yeah. You have to have an environment that the body can heal itself. Otherwise, it's not going to. It cannot.
And so let's transfer that now to psychedelic-assisted therapy. So the things that the body, these impediments in physical wounds, in psychological wounds, it's like these emotions are overwhelming. I can't handle them. I can't get to the root cause because it's too scary. So in a way, with MDMA, you take out the fear a lot of these emotions, and then you can feel the emotions, and then you can process and do the healing. So I think your example was just right.
I was at a function earlier today where there's a Native Hawaiian woman speaking about a story. She goes, everyone knows this story, but I wasn't familiar with it. She talks about a gourd, like a bowl of light. And that's how we're all born. And then over time, there are rocks that are put into that to block the light. But it doesn't mean that the light doesn't shine anymore. So, a lot of times I feel like in healing spaces, that's about allowing those rocks to be removed, and then the light can shine through that was always there. And psychedelics make it easier.
Yeah. Now,
Yeah.
why have psychedelics persisted for thousands of years?
Right.
After intensive efforts to suppress them. Because they provide fundamental tools for us to experience emotions, experience spirituality. These experiences are highly valued by humans, even when these substances have been tremendously suppressed and criminalized. So I think just the survival through thousands of years of the interaction between humans and psychedelic plants, and now more psychedelic synthetics as well, just is a testimony to the value that they possess, that they help us as humans to work through what it means to be human. Now, we haven't talked about this yet, but some people will say, oh, there's a spirit of this ayahuasca, or there's a spirit of the peyote,
Right.
or whatever. And
Like grandfather or grandmother or the snake or so on.
yeah. And so then is there the spirit of MDMA or the spirit of LSD?
What would it be?
I don't know, this spirit of MDMA would probably be like this cosmic hug, sort of, But whether it's gendered or not, it's interesting because, often these psychedelics like grandfather iboga, and different people talk about ayahuasca or peyote in different kind of gendered terms. Different cultures sometimes call the same thing male, or the other culture will call it female. So it's hard to say how much is from the thing and how much is from the culture. But I think that there's all different spirits, even of synthetics. So I guess the spirit of LSD, the way I've described it is that if you think about a diamond, I would say that MDMA is like the diamond polisher and LSD is like the diamond cutter. Like there's something more, in a way, aggressive about LSD, about taking things apart. And so the spirit of LSD would be, I think, a little bit more ethereal, mental, less physical. Peyote, mushrooms, ayahuasca have a more physical aspect to it. But my personal view, I guess, being somewhat more scientific and skeptical, is that these are aspects of ourselves. And so when you say I encountered the spirit of ayahuasca, I would say it's really a part of yourself that is wired in millions of years of evolution that is there to help us move into this different kind of wholeness. So I tend to see them as more internal aspects of ourselves rather than there's the spirit of the mushroom that wants me to do some certain thing.
Well, when you experience all of these psychedelic experiences, then it's pretty clear that everything's one.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not like there's a duality or anything. It's like everything is one. And many times when I've been in ceremony, it's that one is love.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Kind of interesting because when you mention that on MDMA, it kind of makes me think maybe MDMA is the energy is coming from the ground. It's grounding, it's earth, it's land, it brings us in and so on. Whereas LSD a lot of times is like from the cosmos.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
You can take all of the analytical portions of like 32 different things and calculate them all at the same time and so on. Whereas, as I hear you mention in MDMA, it's an embodied experience where I can really feel comfortable being who I am.
That's a good description. Yeah, LSD does seem to be a little bit more heady.
Yeah,
in
you
that
can calculate
way.
like 10,000 things at the same time. You know what I mean? Or I don't know if it's 10,000, but it's like a lot.
Well, okay, let's talk a tiny bit of what I don't really fully understand, but this idea of quantum computing. So in this sort of quantum physics, we are all one. We're all connected in these waves and energies, and the separations are more at a different level of reality, a deeper level of reality. We're all connected. And I think that there's this way in which, with quantum computing, that you're calculating all possible outcomes at the same time somehow. And that's why it can solve problems quicker. And it's only when you crystallize, at a point that it comes out with something specific, but it's somehow or other, calculating all things at the same time.
All I know is that whatever is on the other side of this knows way more than me. I'm pretty much reminded of that.
Yeah, because I think when you're talking about me, so what is me? Me is this egoic sense of, this body, this self, but this body itself is interconnected with so much other and products of billions of years of evolution, and this inner healing intelligence is what we're talking about, that you open up because deeper than our conscious awareness, there's this sense of where we're out of balance or what we need to integrate, and that's what emerges, and we support what emerges. So it's very similar, this concept that it knows more than me.
Yep.
Yeah. And then there is still a me. So there's something else that Stan Grof talks about that I've really gravitated to, this idea. And it's that the idea of this ego is that it needs to be transparent to the transcendent. And what he means by that is that the ego doesn't go away, but many people are sort of only in the sense of self. They don't see the bigger picture. They don't see the interconnected. So you need to have this ego, but it needs to be transparent. You need to be able to see through your individual life to this collective that we're all a part of, that does transcend time and space, and that will, nothing is destroyed, nothing is created, right. So that even after we die, we're not just, this organization of matter is dissipated, but this idea that we are transparent to the transcendent, we can be both ourself and this unitive experience. And I think a lot of people, we know it under the term spiritual bypassing. Mm-hmm. They kind of want to be part of this everything, but they don't want to necessarily refine the individuality. And so you need to really be both fully yourself, but transparent and fully part of this unity. And so it's the same way with light as a wave and a particle. Mm-hmm. We're both. And I think one of the mistakes is because we're so far removed from experiencing this spiritual, mystical, when you finally do experience it, then you may overvalue it and think that's more important than our daily life.
As I was contemplating that, people talk about it's either a wave or a particle, but I don't hear too much about, but what about in between?
Yeah.
Or what about
both? Yes,
outside of that? Or inside it?
Yeah.
Or is there an inside it?
Or it's like potential. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't crystallize into one or another, but it has the potential to be both. It's somehow probabilities these are difficult concepts to understand, and I can't say that I really do, but I think that, the obvious question, like what's before the Big Bang? How could there be a Big Bang? Well, something had to happen before. And where'd it come from? We don't know.
Or even the fact of why do I need to know that?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
That's a really important point too. Yeah. Well, that's where you get back to the acts of simple kindness. We know that simple human kindness means an enormous amount, and there's so much other things that it could be. So, what do you need to know? All this other stuff. You just need to know that this life matters. It feels like it matters to us what happens. And so what happens with the bigger universe, this life matters. And that's all we need to know.
So as we start to get closer to the end, if you were your great-great-great-grandchild and you could tell one specific story about your life that would give me context to like who you are, what would it be?
You've got a talent for asking really tough kind of questions. I guess the essence of me that I would want my great-great-great-grandchild to know. And by the way, I have been connected to my great-grandparents. My great-grandmother moved to Palestine in 1904 in order to die and be buried on the Mount of Olives. That's where the Messiah is supposed to come out of one of the gates of Jerusalem, and then this graveyard is where the people get resurrected first. Oh. So I've had all these relatives. And then my great-grandparents moved to Palestine in 1923 and built a house in 1924 that's now a historical site in downtown Tel Aviv. And there's a skyscraper in the backyard, skyscraper next to it, skyscraper across the street. They had to save the house as part of getting permission to build these skyscrapers, so it's historical. And it's owned by a Canadian nonprofit for what they call lone soldiers. It's people, Jewish people from around the world that go to be in the Israeli army. And it's a community, and they tell the story of the history of the house, and they've kept in touch with my family. So because they have something to do with the military, with soldiers, and we do work with MDMA for PTSD, for war-related PTSD, I asked them if in the basement they have a movie theater to entertain these lone soldiers. I asked them if we could move in there and do training of therapists in Israel by watching videotapes of therapy sessions, if we could use their movie theater. And they said yes. So I got to be in my great-grandparents' house all these years later, 100 years later practically, teaching about MDMA therapy to bring to Israel. So I just felt so connection to my great-grandparents and then to my great-great-grandmother, who's the one that led that. So what would I want my great-great-grandchild to really remember about me? Well, I just had this vision for how I could make a contribution to making a more loving, healthy world to deal with all the traumas, and that I had this idea when I was 18, and that I ended up pursuing that idea basically my entire rest of my life. That just was this vision of what to contribute, and even though it was hard, that I kept at it all this time. That's what I would like them to know, so that they would then say, well, what do I want to do with my life, my precious short life? I would like to do something that matters and that can matter to other people. So I think that would be this good message, that there was just this continuity of this vision when I was 18, and then, the next 50, 60 years doing the same thing.
So let's say you have to put that into a story.
Well, there was also something that I thought we haven't really talked about it yet, but kind of set my future also. So that was that I was confronted with the Vietnam, I mentioned, and what to do about Vietnam. And here was this incredibly destructive, murderous kind of campaign. And we think, 56,000 Americans died, but millions of Vietnamese died as well. Millions. And so how do I respond to a crisis where my country is calling me to do things that I don't think are in the best interests of me or of the country? And I studied Martin Luther King, and I studied Gandhi, and I studied Tolstoy. I studied nonviolent resistance. And so I decided that what I would do would be to not register for the draft and end up, I had a driver's license, I had a passport, I had a social security number, I was paying taxes, I was in high school. I figured I was on all these databases. So I just chose nonviolent resistance, that I would not register for the draft. They would come and put me in jail, and I would cost the system money. And if loads and loads of people did that, then that would bubble up to change policy. So I think the story of having to confront a dangerous, murderous world and trying to come up with a nonviolent way to be engaged, and not to run to Canada or pretend that I had a bone spur or pretend anything, but just to try to make a contribution that moves the world more towards peace and love. I don't know if that's the kind of story that you were looking for.
No, it's good. I forgot to ask you about Maui.
Great.
So,
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, for sure. So, MAPS has mostly worked to make MDMA into medicine for post-traumatic stress disorder through the FDA. We also had sites in Israel and in Canada. We did start a lot of research in Europe, but it's been shut down since then by Lykos, the pharma company, because they're focusing just on the FDA. So what the story of Maui is, that first off, it's a story about long-term friendships. So Matt Lauren and I have known each other for 35 years. We were together in graduate school at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. We did a tremendous project there. We were there, and I was involved in student government during the Tiananmen Square massacre. And again, it was led by student government leaders in China. We were in student government at the Kennedy School, and we wanted to do some kind of a response to that. And so Matt and I worked together to organize protests all over the world on the year anniversary, not of the massacre, but several days before that, the Chinese students did a fast. And so we commemorated the fast, and we actually worked through Congress and managed to get a national day for freedom and human rights in China and Tibet passed through the Congress, and we got George Bush to sign it, even though he didn't want to. Derek Bach, who was the president of Harvard for 10 years, said it was the most effective student activism he'd seen in his entire time at Harvard. So Matt and I formed this friendship upon working towards this kind of social change in a way, working for freedom 35 years ago. And we've kept in touch for this entire time. So Matt contacted me recently and said that because of the fires in Maui, that there was a lot of people with PTSD, and he wondered, could we bring MDMA-assisted therapy to Hawaii to help those people that were traumatized by the fires and the possible negligence, you could say, of the electric companies and all these things. So what we're trying to do, and what brought me here, so the purpose of this trip, why I'm here, why we're having this conversation, is to try to plant the seeds for developing a study that would be done in Maui with people who were traumatized from the fire, the survivors. But also we would try to train local healers so that it would be more culturally sensitive.
Is that only therapists then? Only licensed clinicians?
No, not necessarily, because we have a 2-person team. So when we do individual therapy, it's a 2-person team. The first has to have a license. The second can be like an apprentice.
Oh.
Doesn't need to have a license. What we're thinking about in Maui would be to do a group therapy project as well, because these were people traumatized in a group. Maybe we can reinforce the healing in a group. Maybe the integration process will be supported by people helping each other because they've all been through a similar trauma. So we had meetings that the Clarity Project, Ashley Lukens arranged, and so we met with the governor, we met some major legislators, and what I hope is that by the time that this story airs, that there will be a protocol approved, there will be a plan, there'll be funding in place to do group therapy for people that were traumatized by the fires in Maui.
How could somebody like myself be involved with that? So as a non-clinician, could I participate in that?
Because it's FDA, because it's a Schedule 1 drug, MDMA, we're going to need to get FDA approval. The lead researchers need to get DEA approvals to handle the drug, so that the FDA has set these standards, at least so far, for the credentials for the people that will actually deliver the therapy. So that's where I'm saying the first person needs to be licensed to do therapy, but currently they're saying that the second person needs 1,000 hours of behavioral health experience, preferably mental health.
How do they track that?
Well, let's say you've done sitting at ayahuasca sessions.
Oh, it has to be psychedelic related?
No, not at all. No, you could have worked in a mental hospital, or you could have worked in a halfway house, or helped people that were just out of drug abuse treatment, or if there's just some way that you could demonstrate 1,000 hours of this, that's the current criteria, the minimum criteria set by the FDA.
Okay.
They may even want to change that to be 1 year, but that hasn't happened yet. So the ways to get involved are, what you're doing right now is making sure that we talk about this project so people know about it. That's tremendous. And so we are looking for donations. The donations can be to the Clarity Project, for this Maui project. And another way to help is, one of the most important things that we're going to need over time as psychedelics become more accepted as medicines is we're really going to need more therapists. So it's not something you do right away, but you've got a lot of experience, so you might consider getting the credentials and studying to be a therapist. I mean, again, it's not necessary, but that would be one way to participate. The other is going to be to sort of help tell the story of this so people are aware. One would be through fundraising to encourage people to donate to this project. The other is that in our therapy training program, where we're going to try to train 50 or so Hawaiian therapists in this 6-day program, we don't limit that just to therapists. So you could potentially be one of the people that goes through the training, just so that you can know and speak more about it and let people know about that. Another part is that we're going to have this Psychedelic Science 2025 conference in June, the 16th to the 20th of June in Denver. And it's going to be gathering the entire psychedelic community.
That was a big one.
Yeah. The one 2 years ago was 12,400 people.
Yeah.
It's just mind-boggling. It's just incredible. And so we're going to have another one. So, again, this episode I think will come out before that, so people can think about coming to that. You could also. I think this other idea is just, what do we need to know about culturally specific ways to work with people that were on Maui in the fires? Do they respond kind of in the same way that people on the mainland would respond? Or what kind of cultural things do we need to know? That's going to be a contribution.
Significant.
Yeah, very much so. And I think those are the main ways that you could get involved without being the credentials. Also, talking to politicians. That's what Ashley was talking about too, is that people need to talk to the Hawaiian politicians and say, this is something good. Maybe we could get a grant from the state of Hawaii to do this study. And then if it works, the state of Hawaii will save enormous amounts of money, because now instead of these people being disabled and not able to work and suffering and having other medical conditions, maybe through the healing of their trauma, so that kind of political lobby work, maybe there's a way to get funding from the state for some of the expenses.
Okay. Okay, cool. So hopefully as people listen to this or tune into it, we can get some support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that would be great.
Okay. Well, I appreciate your time. I know you're busy. I mean, it was a whirlwind trip for you.
Yes.
I just want to acknowledge you for all that you've done, your perseverance over decades and decades, basically your life's work that is really out there to help people in a meaningful way.
Yeah. And so, thank you for letting us share the story more widely.
Yeah, I appreciate it. If you resonate with Greater Good Radio, please join our community at www.greatergoodradio.com, where you can get access to exclusive content and offerings. Hope to see you soon.